In the summer of 1941, aboard the flagship of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood under the dim lights of a naval briefing room and stared at a map of the Pacific. Red pins marked Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and the vast blue emptiness between Japan and the United States. Around him, officers spoke with confidence.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
They believed America was soft. They believed Americans loved comfort too much to endure a long war. They believed that if Japan struck hard enough, the United States would accept defeat and negotiate. Yamamoto knew better. He had studied in America. He had driven through the industrial cities of the Midwest. He had seen steel mills that seemed to have no end and oil fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. He understood something many leaders in Tokyo, Berlin, and Rome did not. If the United States truly awakened, it could fight on two sides of the world at the same time and still grow stronger every month. In that quiet room, before the first bomb fell, Yamamoto saw the future, and almost nobody listened. Years earlier, Yamamoto had attended Harvard University and served as naval attaché in Washington. He traveled widely across the United States. He saw the assembly lines of Ford. He saw trains carrying coal and iron day and night. He saw highways crowded with cars and ports filled with merchant ships. To many foreign visitors, America looked distracted and indulgent. To Yamamoto, it looked like a sleeping giant with muscles no nation on earth could match. He reportedly warned that for 6 months to a year after war began, Japan could run wild. After that, he had no confidence. Those words were not poetry. They were mathematics. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler saw the United States through a different lens. He considered it politically divided, racially mixed, and weakened by what he believed was materialism. He mocked American society as a nation that built refrigerators and movie theaters, not armies. Even after President Franklin D. Roosevelt increased military spending in 1940 and 1941, Hitler remained convinced that America lacked the discipline to fight a hard war. German intelligence officers studied U.S. politics and noted strong isolationist sentiment. The America First Committee drew large crowds. Congress argued over aid to Britain. To Hitler, this looked like proof that the United States would never fully commit to a global conflict. In Rome, Benito Mussolini shared the same assumption. He saw the United States as a rich but weak country, far away and reluctant to bleed for Europe or Asia. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and many officers in the Imperial Japanese Army believed that democratic societies were too divided to sustain long sacrifice. They looked at the casualty lists of World War I and the political debates in Washington and concluded that America would lose its nerve if struck quickly and brutally. There were warnings. Yamamoto was the most famous, but he was not alone. Some German officials had concerns after reviewing American industrial statistics. The United States produced more oil than the rest of the world combined. It had vast reserves of coal, iron ore, copper, and aluminum. Its population was over 130 million in 1940. It was protected by 2 oceans. Its farmland fed not only Americans but much of the Allied world. Yet these facts were often dismissed because they did not fit the Axis worldview. Ideology overruled arithmetic. On December 7, 1941, at 7:48 a.m. local time, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Battleships burned. Sailors were trapped below decks. Smoke rose over the harbor as sirens wailed, and men dove into oil-covered water. In Tokyo, the first reports seemed to confirm the strategy. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been badly damaged. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces struck Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. In Europe, Hitler welcomed the news. 4 days later, On December 11, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. At the time, Germany was deep inside the Soviet Union. Japanese forces were racing across Southeast Asia. Mussolini was struggling in North Africa. Axis leaders believed the United States would be overwhelmed by competing demands. How could one nation send armies to Britain, tanks to the Soviet Union, and fleets to the Pacific all at once? How could it defend the Atlantic and the Pacific simultaneously? To them, this looked impossible. President Franklin D. Roosevelt thought differently. Even before Pearl Harbor, American planners had developed the Germany First strategy. Germany was considered the most dangerous enemy because of its industrial power and its domination of Europe. But Germany First did not mean Japan later. It meant that while the main effort would focus on defeating Germany, the United States would still fight a major naval and air war against Japan. It was an enormous commitment. It required not one war machine, but two. The numbers soon became staggering. In 1940, the U.S. Army was smaller than that of Portugal. By 1945, more than 16 million Americans had served in uniform. Factories that once built automobiles switched to tanks, trucks, aircraft engines, and bombers. Women entered industrial work in huge numbers. Shipyards worked around the clock. Universities trained engineers and officers. Farms increased production. Civilian life changed, but the economy expanded rather than collapsed. At Willow Run in Michigan, built by Ford Motor Company, workers assembled B-24 Liberator bombers on a moving production line. The plant covered more than 3.5 million square feet. At its peak, one heavy bomber rolled out roughly every hour. In Detroit, the arsenal of democracy produced tanks and trucks by the thousands. In California, shipyards led by industrialist Henry J. Kaiser built Liberty ships at astonishing speed. One vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, was completed in less than 5 days as a demonstration of what American industry could do. German intelligence struggled to believe the production figures. In 1942, the United States built nearly 48,000 aircraft. In 1943, more than 85,000. In 1944, almost 96,000. By war's end, American factories had produced around 300,000 military aircraft. The United States also built roughly 88,000 tanks, more than 2 million military trucks, and thousands of warships and landing craft. These were not abstract numbers. They were squadrons over Germany, convoys in the Atlantic, and amphibious fleets in the Pacific. Japan had expected American ship losses to weaken U.S. resolve. Instead, American shipyards replaced losses and expanded the fleet beyond anything the Imperial Japanese Navy could match. Fleet carriers, escort carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and amphibious ships poured into service. The Essex-class aircraft carriers became symbols of industrial power. Even when the U.S. Navy suffered setbacks, new ships were already being fitted out. The first 6 months of war seemed to support Yamamoto's warning. Japan swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. On May 6, 1942, Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered Corregidor in the Philippines. It was a dark moment for the United States. Yet even during these defeats, American factories accelerated. New pilots trained in Texas and Florida. New ships slid down launchways in Virginia and California. The war machine was just beginning. Then came June 1942. At the Battle of Midway, from June 4 to June 7, U.S. Navy aviators sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Japan lost many experienced pilots and deck crews it could not easily replace. The United States lost Yorktown, but more carriers were already under construction. Midway was not just a tactical defeat for Japan. It was proof that time was no longer on its side. In North Africa, American soldiers entered combat against Germany in November 1942 during Operation Torch. The U.S. Army was inexperienced and suffered setbacks, especially at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. German commanders initially viewed American troops as untested and poorly led. Some believed this confirmed that the United States lacked military quality. But they missed a critical point. The Americans learned quickly. Equipment improved. Leadership changed. Lessons were applied on a massive scale. General George C. Marshall oversaw the expansion of the Army. Admiral Ernest J. King drove naval operations with relentless energy. General Henry H. Arnold built the Army Air Forces into a global striking force. Dwight D. Eisenhower emerged as the Allied commander, able to coordinate armies from multiple nations. This was another Axis miscalculation. They underestimated not only American resources, but American adaptability. On the Eastern Front, Germany faced the Soviet Union in a brutal struggle that consumed men and equipment at staggering rates. Hitler expected this campaign to be decisive before American power could fully arrive. But the war dragged on. By late 1942 at Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was trapped. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. Germany was now fighting a massive land war in the east, an air war over its cities, and a growing naval and land war against Anglo-American forces in the west and south. At the same time, the United States was supplying allies on an unprecedented scale. Through Lend-Lease, American industry sent trucks, locomotives, food, aluminum, aviation fuel, and communications equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other partners. Soviet offensives often depended on American trucks and railroad equipment. British survival depended on American shipbuilding and escort vessels. China received weapons and supplies over dangerous routes such as the hump airlift over the Himalayas. This was the heart of the Axis mistake. They saw war as a contest of battlefield courage and political will, but they underestimated logistics. A division without fuel could not move. A bomber without aluminum could not be built. A navy without shipyards would shrink after every battle. The United States possessed the industrial base to replace losses faster than any enemy could inflict them. In 1943, American heavy bombers based in England began sustained attacks on Germany. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators struck shipyards, aircraft plants, ball-bearing factories, and oil facilities. By day, Americans attacked. By night, Britain's Royal Air Force returned. German civilians heard sirens almost continuously. Fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe were forced into a war of attrition they could not win. Then came the long-range escort fighter that changed everything. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could escort bombers deep into Germany and back. American pilots challenged the Luftwaffe over its own territory. Germany lost experienced aircrews faster than it could train replacements. By 1944, the skies over Europe increasingly belonged to the Allies. In the Pacific, the United States advanced through the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Central Pacific, and the Philippines. Battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, and Iwo Jima were fought thousands of miles apart. Each required enormous fleets, engineering units, fuel convoys, and air support. The fact that these operations continued while millions of American soldiers prepared for Europe was exactly what the Axis had thought impossible. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated how overwhelming American naval strength had become. It involved hundreds of ships and aircraft in one of the largest naval battles in history. Japan fought with courage and skill, but its industrial base could not replace carriers, pilots, and fuel. American losses were painful, yet the fleet remained intact and growing. On June 6, 1944, at 6:30 a.m., Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord. More than 150,000 soldiers crossed the English Channel in a single day. Thousands of ships and landing craft supported the assault. Artificial mulberry harbors were assembled off the coast. Pipelines carried fuel under the channel. German commanders had long believed such an invasion would be difficult. Many did not think the Allies could sustain it. Within weeks, they were facing an unstoppable buildup of men and material. For Hitler, this was the nightmare Yamamoto had foreseen. The United States was now conducting a strategic bombing campaign over Germany, supporting the Soviet Union, maintaining the Battle of the Atlantic, invading Western Europe, and driving across the Pacific. Rather than choosing one theater, America had become the central industrial and logistical engine in all of them. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, later acknowledged that American industrial capacity dwarfed anything Germany could match. Even when German factories increased production in 1944, Allied bombing and fuel shortages strangled the effort. Tanks left assembly lines without enough gasoline to train crews. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. New weapons could not compensate for collapsing infrastructure. Japan faced the same reality. American submarines devastated merchant shipping, cutting off oil from Southeast Asia. Factories lacked raw materials. Pilot training was shortened. Fuel was rationed. The Imperial Japanese Navy increasingly stayed in port because it could not afford to operate. The United States, by contrast, had abundant oil and secure domestic production. One of the most revealing facts of the war was that the United States did not become poorer by fighting. Its gross national product soared. Unemployment vanished. Industrial output expanded dramatically. Americans bought war bonds, rationed certain goods, and accepted sacrifice, but the economic foundation remained strong. The Axis had assumed democratic societies would fracture under pressure. Instead, American society mobilized on a scale unmatched in history. The human cost was still immense. Families received telegrams from North Africa, Normandy, the Ardennes, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa. Hospitals filled with wounded. Cemetery rows lengthened in Europe and the Pacific. Yet casualty reports did not break American resolve. They hardened it. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the revelations of Axis atrocities deepened the commitment to unconditional victory. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing. In December, Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was his final major gamble in the West. American units were surprised, and fierce fighting erupted in the snow-covered forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. But once again, the United States absorbed the blow and poured in reinforcements, fuel, artillery shells, and aircraft. When the weather cleared, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. Germany had spent irreplaceable reserves for a temporary gain. In the Pacific, battles grew even more brutal. At Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa from April to June 1945, American forces faced determined resistance and kamikaze attacks. These battles showed that Japan would not surrender easily, yet even while sustaining heavy losses, the United States continued bombing Japanese cities and tightening the naval blockade. New ships and aircraft kept arriving. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in Berlin as Soviet troops closed in. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. In Tokyo, leaders still hoped for a negotiated end, but their position was hopeless. American B-29 bombers, operating from the Mariana Islands, burned large sections of Japanese cities. The Navy cut supply lines. The Army prepared for invasion. Then came the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, followed by the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced surrender. After the war, surviving Axis leaders and officers reflected on what had gone wrong. Many cited American production as decisive. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. He knew that industrial capacity, resource security, and geographic depth gave the United States extraordinary resilience. The Axis had mistaken political debate for weakness and consumer abundance for softness. They confused democracy with indecision and prosperity with decadence. The deeper lesson was psychological. Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo often viewed opponents through ideological assumptions rather than objective data. They believed their own systems created superior willpower. They discounted statistics that contradicted their beliefs. Yamamoto, because he had seen America firsthand, trusted what he observed rather than what ideology told him to think. You can almost hear the contrast. In Berlin, officers studying maps under dim lights, confident that America would remain distracted. In Tokyo, planners believing one sudden strike could force negotiation. In Detroit, rivet guns echoing through the night. In California, welders sealing the hulls of new ships. In Texas, cadets learning to fly. In Kansas, wheat loading into rail cars. In Pennsylvania, steel pouring from furnaces. Quietly, relentlessly, the answer to the Axis assumption was being built. The United States did not win because it was invulnerable. It suffered defeats, made mistakes, and paid dearly in blood. It won because it could learn, mobilize, and sustain simultaneous campaigns on a scale no adversary had imagined. It fought Germany across the Atlantic and Japan across the Pacific. It armed allies, fed nations, and replaced losses faster than enemies could inflict them. The warning had been there from the start. Yamamoto saw the factories, the oil, the railroads, and the sheer continental scale of America. He understood that once war began, the question would not be whether the United States could fight two wars at once. The real question was whether anyone could survive fighting against a nation with that much latent power. In the ruins of Berlin and the ashes of Tokyo, the answer was unmistakable. The Axis had gambled that America was too divided, too comfortable, and too distant to sustain a global conflict. They were wrong on every count. The country they expected to tire instead became stronger with each passing month. The democracy they dismissed coordinated armies on multiple continents. The industrial giant they underestimated outbuilt, outshipped, and outflew every enemy it faced. And long before the world saw it, one admiral standing over a map in 1941 had already understood the truth. For a few months, he believed, Japan could run wild. After that, the sleeping giant would awaken. Once it did, two oceans were not barriers. They were highways. Two wars were not an impossible burden. They were simply two fronts supplied by the same unstoppable arsenal.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.